Welcome back to the Teske Brief. I'm Judge Steven Teske, retired. And just as I finished recording a new series, moving away from the Bar Card series and into a conversation about Vice President J.D. Vance's new book that's called Communion and his thoughts on the intersection of policy and religion, we get hit with new headlines. Yeah, you got it. New headlines directly connected to our Bar Card series that we just finished. And it is so stunning and new, I had to take a moment to record this show and get it out there. You know, people occasionally ask me, Judge, did you know all this was going to happen? Well, of course not. No, I don't predict the future. I simply spent 35 years inside the justice system. And systems, well, guess what? They have patterns, right? Lawyers have patterns. Institutions have patterns. If you understand those patterns, you don't predict the future. You just simply recognize, well, when it arrives. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we just witnessed one of those moments. Welcome back, everyone. Do you remember the very first episode of the Bar Card? But I held up that little piece of plastic and said something that became the heartbeat of this series. And that little piece of plastic was my own bar card from the state of Georgia. Okay? Political power is temporary. Professional accountability, folks, isn't. At the time, some people thought I was making a philosophical observation. And I wasn't. I was describing how the legal profession actually works. Because presidents leave office. I've told you that attorney generals leave office. Members of Congress leave office. But you see, bar cards, that little piece of plastic I held up in my bar card series, well, it doesn't leave office. It remains. They follow lawyers for life. And this week, that distinction became very real. You see, folks, a federal judge issued a 56-page opinion examining the settlement negotiated between President Trump and the Department of Justice in that IRS lawsuit. Remember the anti-weaponization settlement agreement that came out of that lawsuit? And then all of a sudden, there was an amendment where all of a sudden President Trump and his family were now immune from any IRS, investigations and lawsuits and audits, rising particularly out of what was $100 million liability based upon one of his real estate holdings in Chicago. But anyway, folks, this wasn't a television commentator. This wasn't an editorial board. This wasn't some social media. This was a federal judge appointed for life, confirmed by the Senate after being appointed by the president, writing a judicial opinion that will become part of the permanent legal record. And the opinion was remarkable. Not because the judge disagreed with the settlement, because she questioned whether the lawsuit itself ever satisfied one of the oldest requirements in constitutional law. And it's this: whether there was actually a case or controversy, which is in the Constitution. You sound familiar? Because we talked about that in the Bar Card series. If you follow this series, that phrase should immediately sound familiar, because we spent an entire episode asking, can a president effectively sue him or herself? At the time, some listeners thought that was simply a provocative title. No, it wasn't. It was the constitutional issue. You see, Judge Kathleen Williams concluded that the plaintiff, that would be Donald Trump, and the government had become what she described as a fully realized unitary interest. Now, I want you to think about that. One unified interest, not adversaries, not opposing litigants. Remember, as I said before, hey, I'm suing you because you hurt me. Well, I'm denying it. And we're going to go to court. No, it was one interest. None of that I just acted out. That's why the framers required genuine adversity before federal courts could exercise judicial power. You see, folks, courts resolve disputes. That's what I did for 22 years of my life as a judge, is resolve disputes. You know, they don't bless agreements. As I read this opinion, I found myself thinking about the journey we've taken together. Remember what a real prosecution looks like? Okay, remember that episode? We talked about prosecutors beginning with evidence, not with people. Remember Target First, Crime Later, that episode? We discussed what happens when the process becomes the punishment. Remember the prosecutor's dilemma? Oh, I got a lot of views on that one. We examined what happens when lawyers are pressured to place loyalty above candor. And then there's this episode, The Cost of Collapse. We talked about experienced lawyers leaving government because they refused to compromise their professional judgment. Why? Because they wanted to protect their bar card. Because you remember this, the bar is watching you. We know that as lawyers. That may have been the simplest message in the entire series. Politics ends, professional accountability doesn't. It keeps going, folks. This opinion doesn't prove every argument we've made, but it does demonstrate something important. The constitutional and ethical concerns we've been discussing are no longer theoretical. They're now the subject of judicial findings and professional scrutiny. The opinion didn't end with constitutional analysis. Judge Williams referred one lawyer to the Florida bar for possible disciplinary proceedings. She also stated, now get this, that she would forward the opinion to the New York disciplinary authorities in connection with their ongoing investigation. Let me say this, remember, ongoing investigation, because I've already reported in a previous podcast about Todd Blanche, and that you had 101 judges, federal and state, who filed a bar complaint against him in New York. And so this judge sent the opinion to that same bar. Let's pause there. You see, that isn't discipline. I know. That isn't guilt. I get it. That isn't disbarment. Well, at least not yet. It's something lawyers understand very well, folks. It is the beginning of the professional process. And due process requires that it proceeds fairly. Mr. Blanche will have an opportunity to respond. The disciplinary authorities will evaluate the facts. That's exactly how our profession is supposed to work. You know, what sentence stayed with me? Not the referrals, not the criticism, this one. The judge wrote that the parties could not use the court to provide legitimacy for an agreement conferring immunity through what was presented as litigation. In other words, the judiciary refused to become a prop. The judge figured it out. No, you don't get to use the court system. You don't get to abuse the process. Okay? That may be the most important lesson in the entire opinion. You know, lawyers have this unwritten rule. If a federal judge writes 56 pages explaining why your lawsuit wasn't really a lawsuit, that's generally considered, well, let's see, how can I put it? A rough day at the office. And if She sends copies, that is the judge, of her opinion to bar disciplinary authorities. You don't schedule a victory tour, folks. You schedule meetings with your ethics counsel. In other words, your malpractice insurance carrier as well. Humor aside, that's because reputations matter. And lawyers spend decades building them. Some people will see this as another political story. No, I don't. Okay. I see it as another chapter in the story of institutions doing what they were designed to do. The courts examine constitutional questions. Bar authorities examine professional conduct. Congress controls appropriations. Each institution has its own lane, right? The system works best when each one remains faithful to its constitutional role. People have asked me throughout this series, right? Judge, hey, were you trying to predict the future? As I said and asked before. And of course, no, I was simply describing the legal profession. Because one lesson has remained true for generations. Political protection has an expiration date. Professional accountability, no, folks, it doesn't. That's why every lawyer should remember that the most important client we ever serve isn't the most powerful one. It's the Constitution. Well, with all that said, I'm Judge Steven Teske, retired, your host. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, protect your reputation, protect your integrity, and above all, protect your bar card. Until the next episode, take care, be safe.